Alors d'abord, je m'excuse parce que je vais parler en anglais. Alors, sumum crede nefas animam preferre pudori e propter vitam vivendi perdere causas. Count it the greatest of all sins to prefer life to honor and to lose for the sake of living all that makes life worth living. With this verse from Juvenal Alenka Supancic illustrates the ethical maxim of the Discourse of the Master. This discourse, one of the four social relations that were the subject of Lacan's 17th seminar from 1969 and 1970, L'Envers de la Psychanalyse, the other side of psychoanalysis, the discourse of, there were the discourse of the master, the hysteric, the analyst, and the university, is characterized by a subject that is in relation to a singularity. That is, a subject that is in relation to a signifier that cannot be substituted or subsumed under a regime of value. It is, Lacan says, a visiting card by which a signifier represents a subject for another signifier. What this card has written on it is what is most meaningful to us, what we, if we had to choose, would prefer to life. Being addressed to death, this card never arrives at its destination. And this, Lacan says, is a shame. C'est une honte. Et devrait produire une ontologie, orthographiée enfin correctement, avec une H. Now, why does Lacan decide on the last session of his seminar on the other side of psychoanalysis to end, quite literally, on a note of shame? In a commentary of this session, Jacques-Alain Miller defines shame as, I quote, related to a primordial other, not one that judges, but instead one that only sees or lets be seen. Differentiating it from guilt, he points out that nudity, for example, produces shame not because it has caused harm, but because it bears upon the subject's jouissance. I quote, that which is more intimate than his will and provokes him to go beyond his will and beyond good and evil, attacking him on the point of his modesty. In other words, all one needs for shame to be there is a gaze, un regard, whereas for guilt, it is a gaze as representative of a set of values. Shame is thus the condition of possibility of the ethical as such, and therefore the minimum dimension that the analytic situation presupposes. The order of this alignment is, as we will see, quite important. Modeling it on Kant's respect for the law, Miller calls this dimension the respect for a master signifier. Without that respect, which is also the interest in one's existence or singularity, there is no shame. And without shame, life has no meaning. It becomes life pure and simple, or primum vivere, with no possibility of transcendence. Lacan's ethics of psychoanalysis understands man as more than a human animal, because he can be represented by a signifier that matters and that has dignity. This relationship to the signifier is a relationship to a second death, which is that which cannot be sacrificed. The signifier is that which, within the field of immanence, survives us. This primordial other, whose gaze is the bearer of shame, is, Lacan maintains in 1970, on the verge of disappearing, and the task of the thinker and the analyst is to resuscitate this gaze. This is why, and this is a quote from Lacan, Pascal et Kant s'est trémoussé comme deux valets en pas se faire vatel. That is, like that honorable servant of a royal court who, after working day and night to organize a festivity for his prince, killed himself when it failed, literally dying of shame. The philosophers, Kant and Pascal, worked hard on their theories in order that life would have a meaning after the death of God. There's a film with Depardieu about Vatel. I don't remember its name. Vatel? They, Miller explains, produces, they meaning Kant and Pascal, produce systems in which it is worth betting double or nothing on life, even though the immortality of the soul, the existence of God, and even freedom remain only hypotheses. At least for Kant, you never get to the assertoric or the apodictic level. It's always on the problematic level, which is still a hypothesis. In practice, the meaning comes not from a transcendent God, but from the immanent effort, the labor employed, and I quote, in order to sustain the other's existence. This is also what Miller sees Lacan doing, laboring away for the signifier in order to sustain the hypothesis of an all-loving father. It is as if the question of shame emerged in the time of shamelessness in order to open the possibility of an act or an invention. The passage from ontology to ontologie, with an H, which can be seen to correspond to the passage from speculative to practical reason in Kant, implies the emergence of that gaze. Lacan's ethics of desire are about preserving the dignity of a master signifier. It has to do with the heroic affirmation that life has a value beyond self-preservation, which also gives a value to death. In this sense, it is, well, there's a parenthesis, in this sense it is antithetical to certain contemporary attempts to derive the ethical from a recognition of a shared vulnerability, which it seems to me what Adriana Cabarero is trying to do in response to a discourse on terrorism. I think her argument is that we're all equally insecure, and therefore we develop some kind of empathy, and that can be the foundation of an ethics. The ethics of desire, on the other hand, are about loyal to singularity. They express a certain nostalgia for a nobility, for whom death is not just, quoting Miller, kicking the bucket. I suppose he's referring to Antigone, which is the heroine of Lacan's seminar on the ethics, who dies because she preserves the law, which is to give a human burial to her brother. So it's that as humans we don't die like dogs; we die symbolic deaths. To illustrate this, Miller recalls Lacan's use of the metaphor of the aristocratic emblem. I quote, that marks the subject with an ineffable singularity, one that cannot be traded or subsumed after, as I said, under the capitalist drive to render everything equivalent. This is the mark that Oedipus retains after having lost all his power and all his possessions, and which allows him to demand, even as a poor, blind old man exiled from the city, the honors that belong to his rank. However, as we said, this respect for a signifier is just the minimum required for an analytic situation. Perhaps it suffices for the creation of a creative subjectivity, one that, as Miller put it, renews the power of symbols. But it is definitely not all there is to be expected. It also gives rise to that, I quote, ridiculous thought, I quote Lacan this time, that well-known consolation that says, I quote again, at least me. To this Lacan replies in Television that it does not constitute progress if it is only for some. The point of analysis is, after all, also to disassociate the subject from his master signifier and show the contingency of its grip, to stop short at the discovery of the pragmatic value of such a relationship, of a subject to a singularity, or to a signifier that matters. To stop here would result in analysis producing, at worst, scoundrels, and at best, self-deluded kings. Thus, it is not a matter of returning to aristocratic virtue, whose simple mechanism akin to bullying Miller unmasks, and I quote Miller. What was aristocratic virtue in its day? a master signifier that was strong enough for the subject to draw upon for his self-esteem, and at the same time, the authorization and the duty to affirm not his equality with, but his superiority over others. Unquote. Thus, for Lacan, ethics cannot be simply about a return to the idea of virtue, of aristocratic virtue. Rather, ethics is a matter of, on the basis of having understood what that loyalty to the signifier means, renouncing the emblem in favor of an ethical commitment to a necessary signifier, one that can be for everyone. I suppose I'm understanding necessary in the Kantian way, and the for everyone in the sense of not of universality but of allness, when Kant makes a distinction between the universality in the sense of formal logic, which is universalitas, and in the sense of transcendental logic, when you take on account content, which is universitas, or allness. For Miller, what provides a model for such ethical system is, he calls it, patriarchal honesty. Following Hegel's dialectical movement from opposing the vile consciousness to the noble consciousness, which culminates in the honest consciousness, he says, Lacan is referring to this part of the phenomenology in the seminar. I quote, "The honest person is evidently one who has already renounced honor, renounced its emblem, and who would like it to be the case that shame did not exist, one who unrolls and veils the real of which this shame is the affect." So the honest paradigm is one that comes on top of shame. When there is already shame, then you can renounce the emblem and become an honest person. And Miller says that in this part of the phenomenology, the noble consciousness leads directly to a shameless, or to a time when there is no longer any shame. This is, with no doubt, the higher aim of analysis, one rendered remote by the fact that the minimum condition is not there any longer, the minimum condition being there not being any shame. For, I quote, "Modern man forgets his death." This was Miller. For to renounce the emblem is not the same as never to have had one in the first place. Lacan's speculative position, which needs to be adopted in order to be superseded by the practical. The noble disposition towards a signifier that matters is only the first step in a sequential movement that subverts the first. Following Kant's warning in his lectures on pedagogy that positive moral education would be impossible if not preceded by the negative, namely discipline, Miller sees Lacan as asking what the place of psychoanalysis is in an era when capitalism is no longer founded on the Protestant work ethic of sacrifice, but instead thrives on its permissiveness. Again, this relates to yesterday's talk in a way. In a desolate time, when the master signifier, the visiting card that represents a subject for another subject, in order to has been torn, thought returns to its one functioning emblems in order to save them from their second death. But what is this return, if not a return to the discourse of the master? And could this not become quite easily an authoritarian return? This is, I think, the danger of a nostalgia for a tragic culture of shame that could be opposed to a culture of guilt associated with a Platonic Christian tradition. I'm simplifying that there would be this dichotomy, but I think there's a danger of placing it in terms of this dichotomy. We know all too well what can be written on this visiting card. The name of a nation, a race, a people, an idea of the good that is arbitrary and non-cosmopolitan. Thus, in order for that relationship to become ethical, there needs to be a further qualification of that signifier that matters, and that would save us from a second death. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it is, if in 1970 Lacan was already doing a diagnosis of a society with no shame, and we have gone farther in that direction it's actually quite easy for things to tip over, and there to be a lot of signifiers that matter, and a lot of people that are ready to heroically give their lives for a cause or to find something that matters more than life. But the problem is, what is that going to be? That needs a further level of analysis. It's not just about restoring that relationship. So in order to illustrate this distinction, I propose to return to a text that is often misread as an ontology, without an H, but that would qualify as an ontologie. André Bazin's foundational essay for film theory and criticism, to appear in Problème de la peinture in 1945, Ontologie de l'image photographique. Perhaps also responding to the eclipse of the gaze, Bazin feels compelled to search for the emblem, an emblem that matters, of cinema. In just a few pages, he historicizes its place within the trajectory of the plastic arts. So he gives a mythical history of the plastic arts, thereby tracing not only its origin but its ideal destination. A clear deontological dimension hides behind Bazin's ontology, and is far more important than the claims by which this text is usually known, namely that photography is an indexical form of representation and therefore stands in closer relationship to the represented than, for example, painting. This is usually how it's quoted as something that talks about the indexical impression of light into the negative, and that therefore has this ontological relationship to the thing. In fact, a close reading of this text qualifies his claims very substantially. Bazin's supposed indexical argument, which gave rise to enough anxiety in the advent of digital photography, is derived from his use of two poignant metaphors to describe the way that photography does away with the mediating subjectivity between model and image through the automatism that characterizes its mode of capturing reality: the death mask and the Turin shroud. However, if these examples are interesting, it is because they expose a peculiar ruse of the argument, namely that with photography we are back to ground zero of magical thought. That's actually, I think, the crucial point of his argument. The text begins by claiming that photography does away with the primordial human need to evade death by substituting the mortal subject, with a representation of it. Bazin calls this need psychological and opposes it to a superior aesthetic aspiration in art. This first need, whose origin lies in la mentalité magique, is a besoin primitif d'avoir raison du temps par la pérennité de la forme. Even when sublimated through civilization, subordinated to logic so that we no longer believe in the ontological identity of model and portrait, he believed that in ancient Egypt people actually thought that there was an ontological identity between the statuette and the mortuary statues and the person. But he says that when that is superseded by reason, that maintains that relationship. It is simply need. The psychological need is simply a need to save the model from a second death, or what he calls une seconde mort spirituelle, what Lacan would call a symbolic death. It is therefore equivalent to the need of being represented by a master signifier, that minimal structure that secures a subject in a relation to a second death. Let us retain this primordial, the sense in which the other that shames is primordial. It is also, according to Bazin, a need that is primitive in the pejorative sense of the word. Unsurprisingly, Bazin is not too keen on this paradigm. This is a reign of illusion and appearance, of trompe-l'œil and trompe l'esprit, he calls it. Less pessimistic than Miller, Bazin does not see this dimension, which belonging in Kant's philosophy to the realm of phenomena or mathematical homogeneity, so fundamentally, he doesn't see it so fundamentally threatened. The Egyptian pharaoh who believes in this transcendence in some way dies happy, believing in the perennial survival of his embalmed body. Or Louis XIV, as he says, se contente de son portrait par l'éperon. The problem arises when art confuses its true aim, which is aesthetic for him, with the lesser aim of satisfying the psychological need. And I quote Bazin, La querelle du réalisme dans l'art procède de ce malentendu, de la confusion entre l'esthétique et le psychologique, entre le véritable réalisme qui a besoin d'exprimer la signification à la fois concrète et essentielle du monde, et le pseudo-réalisme de trompe-l'œil ou de trompe-l'esprit qui se satisfait de l'illusion des formes. The original sin of this confusion, unfortunately reproduced by the indexical theories, the ones that quote Bazin on only that context, is, Bazin claims, perspective. So perspective gives painting the technical possibilities of imitating the external world, and thus of becoming the means of satisfying the psychological need of having a relationship to something that is beyond life, pure and simple. Whereas before its appearance, art could simply occupy itself with its, I quote, seul souci primordial de la réalité spirituelle exprimée par des moyens autonomes, now it was split between a lower phenomenological need and a noumenal or ethical one, which Bazin calls aesthetic. And I quote, Désormais la peinture fut écartelée entre deux aspirations. L'une proprement esthétique, what I'm calling ethical, l'expression de réalité spirituelle où les modèles se trouvent transcendés par le symbolisme des formes, l'autre qui n'est qu'un désir tout psychologique de remplacer le monde extérieur par son doute. Placing himself in the position of the analyst, Bazin provides a construction which makes of photography the remedy of this confused condition. Like any remedy, it is made of poison. The solution, Bazin must have thought, would be to return to magical thinking, to return to the belief in the ontological identity of model and portrait, and nothing better than photography to arouse this irrational belief. Rather than denouncing this pouvoir irrationnel de la photographie qui emporte notre croyance, he wants us to liberate once and for all the plastic arts of their obligation to serve the popular demand for illusion. Not only is the painter free from his duty as a portraitist of the aristocrat that wants to see his master signifier hung from the hallway, now people of the most humble origin can have their transcendence in the family album. Photography for him democratizes the relationship to a master signifier. The camera lens, l'objectif, exposes the masses to the dignifying gaze that is bare of shame. However, if photography a permis à la peinture occidentale de se débarrasser définitivement de l'obsession réaliste et de retrouver son autonomie esthétique, it is because it is a boundary, a vehicle through which art can again transcend the phenomenal, the realm of pseudo-reality, and dedicate itself to true realism, which has to do not with appearances but with essences, according to Bazin. Here, photography's homogeneity with the appearance from which it proceeds, or with the thing from which it proceeds, will not suffice to achieve its ideal. It will need, as Bazin concludes this very short essay, the syntax of cinema. He says, autrement, le cinéma est un langage. It will need to become language. Like respect for the master signifier, photography is not the end point, but the beginning of a journey where ontology was simply an excuse. For if la photographie bénéficie d'un transfert de réalité de la chose sur sa reproduction, which is the magical thinking, and this is it resembles, and in this it resembles the Turin shroud. It is insofar as it is a magical object, a relic. What this analogy implies is that to believe in the proposed ontology, without an age, is not different than to believe in the power of the death mask to withdraw the body from material corruption. Thus, the anxiety concerning digital technology could be easily cured through another construction that can enlist our proclivity for magical thought into a new ontology, say, for example, the etymology of digital that approaches it to the touch, or to say that it is more accurate because it has better sensors of light. We were speaking about that yesterday. There are a lot of ways of saying that digital photography is still indexical. But that's not what matters at all for Bazin. So photography is for Bazin the pharmacon, a psychoanalytic cure for the plastic arts. What is important to underline is that the end of analysis... Oui, non, ça va. Je crois que c'est trop long. What is important to underline is that the end of analysis does not lie in the psychological satisfaction, but necessitates a leap into the aesthetic. Reducing Bazin's argument to the analogy between photography and the death masks, ignoring the ambiguity of these references, and taking the imprint of the real as a result of the indexical relationship between light and negative, is akin to believing in an analyst construction and then stopping short at this belief. It would be like thinking that the solution to our epoch of shamelessness is to restore aristocratic virtue, or for that matter, the good old patriarchal values that our society abandoned. Thus, there are two important points of convergence between Bazin and Lacan's interventions. Bazin places ontology in the realm of magic and calls for a movement from this psychological necessity to an aesthetic necessity. Only when this lower psychological necessity has been fulfilled can the image be freed from its merely imitative function. I want to suggest that shame is for Lacan of the order of this psychological need. As Sartre shows in his famous passage in Lettres le Néant, the subject is constituted as such by a gaze. Only when this relationship is established is the analyst able to perform the operation that makes the subject renounce this emblem, or move from an arbitrary emblem to a necessary one, from an at least me to the creative subjectivity to a for all. Now is this operation one of guilt? Not necessarily, but guilt does not need to be discarded. Irrational guilt can also be, as Schupanschik says, a Kantian proof that there is also a causality from freedom. Her argument is that something that psychoanalysis notices, or a phenomenon that psychoanalysis notices, is that sometimes we feel guilty for things that we could have in absolutely no way affected. And if we can have that affect in some way that is, again, I think she calls it a primordial participation in freedom, because we realize that then a causality that is completely deterministic is not all there is. That there could be, that things could have been otherwise, and when we realize that things could have been otherwise, even if it's in an irrational manner, then we somehow prove that there's a participation, the possibility of participating in freedom. But what needs to be avoided is a perversion of this relationship between the primordial gaze and the second gaze, in the sense of having a first level of a gaze that sees, and then only then a gaze that can perhaps be imbued with some values. So perversion, from the Latin pervertere, means to turn around, means also to turn around. To shame is the other side, that shame is the other side of psychoanalysis, also means that it is its perversion. In the same way as the discourse of the master is a perversion of the discourse of the analyst. It's actually, Lacan has 4 formulas for the discourses, which are produced by a rotation of 4 turns. And when you, so the discourse of the analyst and the discourse of the master are exact opposites in the way that you do 2 rotations and then you enter. I want to end with a note on what could be seen to constitute in actuality a perversion of the gaze bearer of shame and the gaze bearer of guilt. Now, in the case of the inversion of the discourse of the master being the opposite of the discourse of the analyst, I think that the argument here is also that you need a relationship to this master signifier in order to have analysis. So it's not perversion in the sense that we would associate it with something necessarily bad. It's just the other side, I suppose, is a better way of saying it. The other side of psychoanalysis is shame, in a sense. So taking Bazin's argument literally, we could ask whether digital photography, due to causes that are much more complex than a presumed loss of indexicality, does not indeed break the magic spell of the death figurine. So now I'm taking the perversion of the Bazin's argument literally in some way. Let's say that we have lost something in this passage. Now what could we have lost? Common man is again cut off from his transcendence. The gaze of the objective is no longer the gaze that is a bearer of shame. Instead, the eye of the digital camera is split between the eye of the other that accuses, not shame but already guilt, in the CCTV, and the eye that shames so as to enjoy.
Must explain what is CCTV.
Oh yes, a CCTV is their... Sorry?
Closed circuit television?
Closed circuit television.
Video surveillance.
But that there are a lot of them in England.
In England.
Yes. So that would be one of the forms of this perversion of a gaze that doesn't shame but just accuses. And then the other side of it would be the eye that shames so as to enjoy, and I'm imagining something like reality TV. That it is a gaze that enjoys a ridicule of the other, which are the 2 sides of a perverse superego. In some way you could say that the perverse superego is one that enjoys accusing. In the case of the first, it is the eye of a law that has itself, and now I'm speaking about a more specific context, which is the recent riots in England. I don't know how much of that. The recent riots in England and how they were, I don't know if they were. Wait a second.
Yes, riots.
Riots, yes. So in the first case of the CCTV camera, which were used to incriminate a lot of people and to trial them very quickly and put them in jail. In the case of the first, it is the eye of a law that has itself no shame, in the sense that it has lost credibility. Void of credibility, it only has its ability to punish. Thus, in the recent London riots, commentators like to stress the fact that no one seemed to care about being filmed in delinquent action, despite the fact that this would probably result in severe incrimination. This is symptomatic of an inversion of the situation, namely that the primordial other is one that accuses and not one that sees. There is a gaze of guilt in the eyes of an arbitrary civil and not cosmopolitan law, without shame. The other that sees cannot be restored through another that accuses. The other form of perversion that I'm trying to say that there is that the other, before that. The other that has to be presupposed in order for morality to have any value is a consistent other. The inconsistency of the other that accuses, in the case of the London riots, is made more than evident through the converse phenomenon. The recent British hacking scandal, of which I don't know how familiar you are, but there was a scandal in which a lot of the tabloids owned by Murdoch were found out to have been listening to, sorry, how do you say it? Yes, yes. of a lot of people in order to find where they were, and also of, well, we can speak more about the detail later. But it was a big scandal, and people haven't been sentenced yet, or it's going to be a very long process. So in this scandal, the power of the gaze as a bearer of shame is shown in its possible perversion. Here, the all-seeing eye of technology is employed in the service of a media industry that lives off the gaze power to shame. I suppose I'm also referring to the more general phenomenon of the sensationalist press that has a lot of scandals, and there is a lot of shame in it, but it is for a gaze that enjoys the shame. So the gaze that shames as to enjoy is a sort of inversion of Sartre's scene of shame, in which a subject looking through a keyhole becomes conscious of his position as soon as he hears the rattle of leaves behind him. In this scene that I speak about before, is just somebody looking through a keyhole, that at that moment the subjectivity is somehow annihilated, or you're only what you see, you're not aware of your own person, but as soon as you hear that there's somebody looking at you, you become split in your subjectivity. You're aware of yourself as being seen. Lacan talks about that in Seminar 11 as the instance of the appearance of the gaze. To be seen enjoying is what produces shame. What the tabloid phenomenon produces is a further level of gaze, the gaze behind the gaze, that shames and enjoys this view. As Miller comments, we are enjoined not to be ashamed of our jouissance. Now, if the historical context of Lacan's intervention is the death of shame, this doesn't mean that all we need is a restoration of the gaze, that is a bearer of shame, or that we simply need a relationship to a second death. If shame is, as Lacan suggests, the other side of psychoanalysis, and the analytic operation is one of separating the subject from his master signifier, from his emblem or death mask, then there should be no shame without analysis.